G'day, my name is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Hebrews. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session of Hebrews. We're looking at chapter 12, verse 12 to 29. Last session, we saw that the Hebrew believers were given two incentives to carry on in endurance of faith. They showed, the writer showed them the heroes of faith of chapter 11, the Old Testament saints, and also Messiah himself, the suffering of Messiah himself. We saw that the Old Testament saints were witnessing to them as concerning the life of faith, that it can be won. And these heroes of faith should be in the minds of the believers, and they should be aware of what they have accomplished through faith and the exercise of patient endurance. And remember, it's all about these guys that they want to go back into the old system because they're being persecuted. So patient endurance is a necessity in this instance. The race that we're running, that they're running, is a marathon that goes from the day of salvation right down to the time when we leave this earth. And so as believers, we need to train down, as it were, to our race weight. It's a marathon. We need to lay aside all impediments. The race is not, it's not a passive luxury of a race. It's a grueling, agonizing race. And that is why one has to run with patient endurance by faith. No other way to accomplish this race. To prepare for this race, these believers, they need to look away from all distractions. They need to focus on the finish line. And the finish line is Jesus. Remembering his endurance of pain, his humiliation, and the shame of the cross. The saints of chapter 11, they failed at times, but Jesus, the man, never failed. He is the perfect example of obedience and patient endurance, so that we need to be constantly focused on him. These Hebrew believers need to remember what he endured, and then they'll realize that their sufferings are mild and they won't be discouraged in the midst of their suffering. None in the Judean church had as yet died as martyrs, but these men and women need to be so antagonistic to sin. They need to be so striving against sin, especially a sin in this area of apostasy, of going back into Judaism to escape persecution, that they should be willing to be martyred in their stand. Now, what's the purpose of suffering? It's to bring about maturity in the children of God. God is disciplining them and us as sons. Discipline comes from a father-son relationship, and women as well, father-daughter relationship. And as believers, we are sons of God by adoption. And these guys should not disregard or should not regard discipline lightly by not letting it teach them. They ought not to give up and collapse in this endurance. God is chastising them because they are sons, and so they need to pass through this time of trial with patient endurance. Chastening should be personally accepted and take effect in day-to-day living. Abundant life on earth is one product of discipline. The second product of God's discipline is holiness in this life. Both of these are dependent upon acceptance with patient endurance. At the time, all discipline is painful. It's not joyous. It's actually grievous. But God's divine purpose is accomplished through sorrow. And the result of this is that these Hebrew believers will bring forth peaceable fruit with righteousness. They'll go from having a rebellious spirit to one of submissiveness in righteousness. And the purpose of this is to show that divine discipline is to bring them to maturity. And in this session now, what we're going to be looking at is faith and the believer's obligations. And this is from verse 12 to 29 of chapter 12. We see the obligations in verses 12 to 17. In verse 12 to 13, the author now deals with the obligation to the weaker members of the assembly. Verse 12 and 13. Wherefore, lift up the hands that hang down and the palsied knees, and make straight paths for your feet, that which is lame be not turned out of the way, but rather be healed. So he begins here with the word wherefore. Wherefore? Well, in light of the fact that discipline is a sign of sonship, and discipline is necessary to develop the peaceable fruit of righteousness, there are certain obligations toward the weaker members in the assembly. Since discipline is necessary and painful in the father-son relationship, the stronger members should make sure that discipline becomes effective. The obligation here is to strengthen the weaker members where it is possible and to remove stumbling blocks to the development of peaceable fruit as much as it is possible. The writer makes several illustrations, and he's using the human body. First illustration deals with the hands. He says, lift up the hands that hang down. And the Greek here emphasizes a reinvigoration. Reinvigorate the hands which are relaxed. Lift up the hands as did we see Moses, and he won victories for others through the lifting up of hands. The second illustration deals with the knees, and it says the palsied knees. Reinvigorate the knees that have become feeble or paralyzed. They need to be strengthened, for if they're not strengthened, they will not hold up in the day of battle. Make straight paths for your feet, that which is lame be not turned out of the way, but rather be healed. So what he's saying here is, make smooth the paths for weak feet, in order that the limping may not be knocked out of joint, but rather be healed. Not all runners in this race are going to be in tip-top physical condition. Some are injured, they're lame, but they must continue, and eventually they must complete the race. The path must be made straight so that they do not keep going round in circles. And the Greek word for lame here means to be pulled out of joint. And it's the same word which is used in the Septuagint version of 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 21, where Elijah said to the people, how long go ye limping between the two sides? Either Jehovah is God or Baal is God. Make your choice. It is necessary here that the reader's paths be made straight and smooth, so that those who are following God may not be turned aside, but may continue to walk down that straight path. In this way, they'll be healed. Now, we're talking here, the writer is talking here about spiritual healing in this context. He's not talking about physical healing. And the reason I say that is because this can be seen due to the fact that all of the illustrations used in this context refer to spiritual weakness. Isaiah, he jubilantly encourages the believers, strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear, your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save. That's in Isaiah 35, verses 3 to 4, where he uses the same terminology. In verse 14, he goes on to say, follow after peace with all men, and the sanctification without which no man shall see the Lord. So now the writer is now dealing with the believer's obligation to himself. Follow after peace with all men. The word follow here, it means to make an eager pursuit. Virtually, it says, do not rest until you have attained it. Eagerly pursue peace with all men insofar as it is possible, but especially pursue the sanctification without which no man shall see the Lord. Now, several times in this book, the author has drawn a contrast between positional sanctification, and that's what we are in the Messiah, and practical sanctification, and that is how we live out our day-to-day living. And the way to pursue the sanctification, which is positional, is by seeking practical sanctification in their day-to-day living. Now, without positional sanctification, one cannot see God. Well, why is that? Because those who have believed have already been positionally sanctified. If you do not believe in God, you cannot be sanctified, therefore you cannot see God. So chicken and the egg. But now these guys, they must make that sanctification practical in day-to-day living. And one way to make sanctification practical is to seek peace among people, especially among fellow believers. The Apostle Paul, when he wrote his epistle to the Romans, he stresses the pursuit of peace. In Romans 12, verse 18, he says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So this pursuit of peace in day-to-day living is part of our practical sanctification. And then in verses 15 to 17, we see he spells out a couple of obligations here. Verse 15, looking carefully, lest there be any man that falls short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby the many be defiled. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person, as Esau, who for one mess of meat sold his own birthright. For you know that even when he afterward desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. For he found no place for a change of mind in his father, though he sought it diligently with tears. Now, in these verses 15 to 17, after spelling out the two obligations, which was taking care of the weaker brethren and living with peace with others, he gives some dangers here which we need to be aware of. And these are the dangers before the believer. In the first part of verse 15, he begins with the words looking carefully. And the Greek is one word, and it is the origin of the English word episcopal. Episcopal. It means to see in the sense of having oversight by someone in the position of authority. So what we see here is that there must be constant spiritual oversight by each one over his life and his attitudes. It's a constant thing. There is a danger of a three-stage progression downward if the readers fail to keep on the lookout as to where they are at spiritually. We need to keep an eye on it. And in the second part of verse 15 and verse 16, the three steps begin with the word lest, L-E-S-T. The first downward progression is a failure to progress, lest there be any man that falls short of the grace of God. Falling short means a moral separation. It is not just a mere defect. It is a moral separation. It is the failure on the part of the children of God to apprehend or to appropriate the grace when something negative or some challenge, some trial comes into our lives. It has here the image of people being on a journey and someone is lagging behind other travelers on this journey and never reaches the end. These guys, they fail to heed the admonition of Hebrews 4:16, which was to draw near to the throne of grace in order to receive mercy and find grace. Grace is help in our time of need. Believers stumble and fall behind in their spiritual lives because they fail to appropriate the grace that is always available. And the failure to appropriate grace is the first step downward, for it means a failure to progress upward. Second step downward is positive infidelity, or it's an unfaithfulness to a moral obligation. He says, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby the many be defiled. Now, when the author, it refers to a root of bitterness, he deals both with the root and with the product, and the product of that root is bitterness. And this phrase, we find this back in Deuteronomy 29, verse 18, Deuteronomy 29, 18, where he says, where this is Moses, he says, lest there should be among you a root that bears gall and wormwood, bitterness. And he used it of the Israelites regarding involvement in idolatry. But here the writer is using it here, the development of a hardened, unbelieving heart, which we see here. He goes back to chapter 3, verse 15, virtually says, take heed, brethren, lest haply there shall be in any one of you an evil heart of unbelief in falling away from the living God. It's like that traveler falling behind, lagging behind. They have become here a root that produces poison. People with a root of bitterness cause divisions and church splits. The failure to appropriate grace during a time of suffering or trial leads to bitterness resulting from the suffering. And that bitterness will eventually result in the defilement of many others. And this is how the root of bitterness manifests itself. Bitterness in the heart leads to murmuring with the tongue. Murmuring with the tongue means murmuring against other people. Others are then defiled by the reader's murmuring, and the murmuring is now caused by the root of bitterness. And so what happens is they defile others by talking against the leaders of the church. And the first step affects only the individual, but guess what happens? The second step begins to affect others as well. And here, what they're doing is they're failing to pursue or to have peace with all men. Third step downwards is an open contempt of duty and privilege. Verse 16, lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one mess of meat sold his own birthright. So here now we see the third step downward is to become either a fornicator or a profane person. Now, he uses Esau here as an example. Now, Esau was not a fornicator, but he was a profane person. And the background to this is found in Genesis 25, verses 27 to 34. Genesis 25, 27 to 34. The Greek word profane applies to one who tramples upon spiritual matters. Now, Esau was a profaner because he trampled upon spiritual things. There are two obstacles to holiness in everyday living. The first obstacle is personal impurity or fornication. Second obstacle is a failure to lay hold of the blessings that are available. Esau is an example of the second obstacle. He had blessings available to him because of his birthright, but he failed to take hold of them. Esau, he sold his own birthright and the blessings that went with it. And the selling of his birthright for only one mess of meat shows how little he thought of God's blessings and his own privileges. And according to verse 17, Esau later desired to inherit the blessing, but it was too late. When Esau sold his birthright, it was a once and for all irrevocable decision. From then on, he could no longer get the blessing of the covenant. He sold the blessing with the birthright and was rejected since his decision was now irreversible. Now, the Hebrew believers to whom this letter was written are warned lest they also make an irrevocable decision that will cut them off from blessings. Here again, the author is dealing with blessings. He's not dealing with salvation. It's blessings. Now, in most sermons, a little bit of burst in Jacob and Esau here. Yeah, in most sermons dealing with Jacob and Esau, Esau is characterized as good, Jacob is characterized as bad. Jacob committed some sins, yes, such as deceiving his father, but he did not trick his brother. He did not trick Esau into selling his birthright. People who preach that Jacob was bad take Esau's complaint, which was that he was going to die, too seriously. The book of Genesis shows that by this time, Isaac was a wealthy man. He had many tents and many servants. All Esau had to do was to go to the next tent and he would have received something to eat. But he didn't want to eat the food being prepared in the other tents. He wanted to eat the lentil soup Jacob was preparing. Esau was willing to sell his birthright for one bowl of lentil soup. He made an irrevocable decision when he sold his birthright. Genesis clearly states that he did more than just sell his birthright. Genesis 25:34 says that Esau despised his birthright. He despised it. And that is why he's called a profaner. He despised his birthright. He was aware of the blessings available to him, but he cared nothing about being used by God. Esau sold the birthright to Jacob, who cared very much about being used by God. And later on, when Esau recognized that by selling his birthright, he also sold some material blessings as well as the spiritual blessings, he wanted it back. Jacob didn't steal the patriarchal blessings from Esau. When Isaac was getting ready to bless Esau, Esau should have told his father the blessing no longer belonged to him since he had sold the birthright to Jacob. But Esau wanted the patriarchal blessing, and it was he who was trying to steal the patriarchal blessing from Jacob. The blessing no longer belonged to Esau, it belonged to his brother Jacob. Jacob was wrong in deceiving his father, but he was not guilty of stealing the patriarchal blessing from his brother. Esau had sold it to him. Now, as for Esau, verse 17 here states that afterward he desired to inherit the blessing. So this shows that later Esau realized what the blessing involved, both material and spiritual blessings. And he tried to get the blessing back without dealing with his sin, because it goes on to say here, for he found no place for a change of mind. Some text, you might have it in your Bible, you might have in his father inserted there. That's actually not in the Greek. That's why you'll see it in italics. It's not actually in the Greek. It just says he found no place for a change of mind. So there was no change of mind in Esau. In other words, Esau wanted the blessing, but he was not willing to repent. He tried to get the blessing back without dealing with his sin. Natural birth does not bring blessing. Faith brings blessing. He was rejected because he made an irrevocable decision. Now, having been rejected, there was no undoing the sin of despising his birthright, because there was not found in him a change of mind or repentance. Again, this verse is not dealing with loss of salvation, but with the loss of rewards in this life. Esau had neither faith nor patient endurance and was cut off from the place of blessing. He sought the blessing later with tears, but he had reached the point of no return. Now, the application to these Jewish readers is that they too can make a once and for all irrevocable decision by going back into Judaism. And this will mean that they too will be cut off from the place of blessing. They'll lose blessings available in this life and rewards in the age to come. Back in chapter 6, the writer already pointed out that if they return to Judaism, they will make an irrevocable decision and they'll be under the sentence of death. And that sentence of death was only a short while away. It was coming in from history, we know, in AD 70. And the author is dealing with the temporal consequences of sin, with the fact that it is possible to forfeit future rewards for present security. Now we see the believer's position in verses 18 to 24. And we'll read 18 to 24 here. For you are not come onto a mount that might be touched and that burned with fire, and onto blackness and darkness and tempest. And the sound of a trumpet and the voice of words, which voice they that heard entreated that no word more should be spoken unto them. For they could not endure that which was enjoined. If even the beast touch the mountain, it shall be stoned. And so fearful was the appearance that Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake. But you are come unto Mount Zion and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable hosts of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better than that of Abel. So in describing the believer's position, the author draws a contrast here between where they're not at Mount Sinai, and where they are. The negative is in verse 18, for you are not come. And the positive is in verse 22, but you are come. Yeah, just quickly, what he's saying is this. If these Jewish believers go back into the old system, they're returning to a place that was inaugurated by utter terror. And that's in verses 18 to 21 here. But in contrast, if they leave a place of privilege and grace as exemplified by the heavenly city in verses 22 to 24. So first, negatively, verses 18 to 21, for you are not come. Negatively, the readers have not come to a place of terror, right? Let's go on. The author here goes back to Exodus and Mount Sinai, and that's what happened there, where he now makes several points. First up, he says, you have not come to a mountain which cannot be touched. And the background here is Exodus 19, verses 12 to 25. That's where the Israelites came. Remember, they couldn't touch that mountain. Second, they have not come to a mountain burning with fire. And we see that in Exodus 19, 18. The third thing is, they have not come to a place of darkness, blackness, and tempest. Again, Exodus 19, and also Deuteronomy 4:11 and Deuteronomy 5, verse 22. They have not heard the sound of a trumpet. Exodus 19, again, 16 to 19, and Exodus 20, verse 18. They have not heard the voice of words, and these were the words of God, which we find in Exodus 19, 19 and Deuteronomy 4, verse 12, and the words of God were such that the Israelites begged. They says, we do not want to hear the voice of God again. And we find it in Exodus 19, verse 20. They were petrified. So the Mosaic law, which is what the writer is alluding to here, the Mosaic law was inaugurated in the context of terror. So what he is saying is to go back to the law was to go back to a place of terror. Now in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 2 to 18, Paul teaches that going back to the law is returning to a ministry of death and condemnation. The writer of Hebrews then quotes from Exodus 19, 12 to 13 to show that Mount Sinai, where the law was given, was untouchable. Remember, if they touched it, they'd be stoned to death. Even an animal touched it, they'd be stoned to death. And furthermore, in verse 21, this was in verse 20, Exodus 19, Moses also felt the terror more than anyone else. Writer quotes Deuteronomy 9:19 to show that even Moses was repelled by the scene on Mount Sinai, and he wasn't attracted to it either. Now, if the believers return to Judaism, they are going to return to the system of law which brings terror, death, and condemnation. Second, as believers, they're not at Mount Sinai, but they're not at Mount Sinai under the system of Mosaic law. But positively, verses 22 to 24, they have come to a system of grace. He says here, but you are come onto Mount Zion and onto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. They should be breathing a great sigh of relief. This is the city in heaven that is destined to be the dwelling place of all the redeemed. This is the city Jesus spoke about in John 14, verses 2 to 3, John 14, 2 to 3, where he says, I'm going to go and prepare a place for you. Paul spoke of this Jerusalem of God in Galatians 4, verse 26, as being a city that is free and not in bondage. This is the city that Abraham sought in Hebrews 11:10. The writer will also mention it again in Hebrews 13, verse 4. This is the city that John describes in Revelation 21:1 to 22:5. This is the abode of all the redeemed of all time who enter it either by resurrection or translation. There are three names given to this city. First, it is the Mount Zion in heaven. Second, it is the city of the living God, because that's where God dwells. And third, it is the heavenly Jerusalem, because it is in the third heaven. Now, the author continues listing 6 categories of occupants who live in this city. It's not a complete list. He doesn't mention the Holy Spirit, but the presence of the Holy Spirit is cited in the Revelation passage. But this is just a sample list. The first occupants are the holy elect angels. There are myriads of angels. It says innumerable hosts of angels. And these angels are spoken of in Deuteronomy 33, verse 2, Deuteronomy 33:2, and Daniel 7:10. And the Greek word means they are in a festive gathering. It's a big celebration. It's a huge party. Second occupants who live in this city are the General Assembly and Church of the Firstborn. Now, he may be referring to the church as a whole, but because he specified the Church of the Firstborn, this may be a special reference to the Jewish believers of the first century. While they comprise only a part of the church, they are the firstborn ones registered in heaven. And this then would be similar to James chapter 1, verse 18, where the Jewish believers are called first fruits. So the firstborn, it may be a special reference to Jewish believers of the first century, but again, they're simply a representative of the church as a whole anyway. So the church as a whole will eventually be in the New Jerusalem. We'll all be there. The third occupant of the city is God, the judge of all in heaven. And this specifically refers to God the Father and emphasizes his role as judge. God the Father will someday judge all in heaven. Fourth occupants living in the city are the spirits of just men made perfect. And these are the Old Testament saints. And the author calls them spirits, which points out that they're not yet united with their bodies because the resurrection of the Old Testament saints hasn't yet taken place. It doesn't take place till after the tribulation. They are just men made perfect. They're just men or justified men because they were justified and saved when they believed. These are men like Abraham, like Isaac, like Jacob. When Abraham believed God, it was reckoned to him for righteousness. And at that point, Abraham was clearly a justified man, as the believers are justified. Nevertheless, the Old Testament saints could not be perfected by the blood of animals. And when Jesus died, he died for and he removed their sins. And we saw that back in chapter 9, verse 15. Only then were the Old Testament saints perfected. So these are spirits of just men who became just or righteous, declared righteous when they believed during their lifetimes, but they were then made perfect with the death of the Messiah. Now, notice here that the author makes a clear distinction here between Old Testament saints and church saints. The fifth occupant living in the city is Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant. So the city is the home of God the Son, who mediated the new covenant of chapter 8. Now, there are two different Greek words here for new. Most of the time when the Bible mentions the new covenant, it uses the Greek word kainos, K-A-I-N-O-S, meaning new in quality or new in nature. But this one time here in the book of Hebrews, the writer uses a different Greek word, neos, N-E-O-S, which means new in point of time. So this is the new one in point of time, the new covenant. The new covenant was recently made because Jesus had recently died. It emphasizes it's a fresh and recent revelation that came through the Messiah. And the sixth occupant of the city is the blood of sprinkling that speaks better than that of Abel. So this emphasizes the fact here that the new covenant was ratified by better blood. It was ratified by Messiah's blood. Earlier on in chapter 9, verses 11 to 12, and chapter 9, 23 to 24, the author related how Jesus brought his blood into the Holy of Holies of the heavenly tabernacle. And now the author adds that blood is still visibly there on the mercy seat in the tabernacle in heaven, since that is where the original Ark of the Covenant is found. And we find that in Revelation 11, verse 19. Revelation 11, verse 19. Now this blood of sprinkling, it speaks better than that of Abel. Now, in biblical history, Abel was the first person to offer a blood sacrifice. And this is a testimony that even though Abel is now dead, blood is still the only acceptable way to God. But now there is better blood in a better place. And this better blood in this better place continually speaks to men. This is the blood of Jesus. His is the only blood that can bring one into God's presence. Therefore, it is the only blood that is the means of acceptance and approach to God. While Abel's blood continually speaks on earth, Messiah's blood speaks continually from heaven. It testifies that he will someday come back to the earth, judge, and bring in the millennial kingdom with the full application of the new covenant. We see that in verses 25 to 27. Now, while some commentators take the presence of the blood as being purely symbolic and not literal, there's nothing in the context that implies a non-literal meaning, since the first five occupants are all literally, they're all literal. God, Jesus, the saints, the just men. There's no exegetical reason to deny the literalness of the blood. The blood is there. Now, these Jewish readers as believers are identified with the heavenly Jerusalem where these six occupants are living. So if the readers go back into Judaism, they'll not lose their citizenship in the New Jerusalem as such because of their position and their association with the New Jerusalem. However, they will lose out on the blessings of this life. They will suffer the terror with which the old covenant was given while they're on earth. More specifically, they will suffer the terror of the judgment of AD 70 destruction. Now we have the fifth warning. Remember, we had these parenthetical warnings, and this one is a warning against indifference in light of better blood in a better place. And this is verses 25 to 29 of chapter 12. See that you refuse not him that speaks. For if they escape not when they refused him that warned them on earth, much more shall not we escape who turn away from him that warns from heaven. whose voice then shook the earth. But now he has promised, saying, yet once more will I make to tremble not the earth only, but also the heaven. And this word, yet once more, signifies the removing of those things that are shaken, as of things that have been made, that those things which are not shaken may remain. Wherefore, receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us have grace whereby we may offer service well-pleasing to God with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire. So here in verse 25, the writer again reminds the believers of the past. In the past, they rejected an earthly dispensation, but the one now speaking is from heaven. The exhortation is as follows. See that you refuse him not that speaks. And the word see here is in the emphatic position, and the Greek is much stronger than the English. What in the Greek it says, beware lest. So what it's doing here is that it emphasizes an obligation that they have in light of what he previously said in verses 18 to 24. The word refuse has the concept of rejecting. The Greek word for refuse is the same word found in chapter 12, verse 19, where the Israelites entreated or begged that God would not speak to them again down at Mount Sinai. So the application, what is the application? Well, what he's saying here is virtually this. He says, look, don't stop your ears to the voice of God as the Israelites did at Mount Sinai. Beware lest you refuse or lest you reject him. And when the writer says him that speaks, he uses the present tense in that God is still speaking even now. He's continually speaking. He's continually speaking to believers. He's drawing a contrast here between heaven and earth. For if they escape not when they refused him that warned them on earth, much more shall we not escape who turn away from him that warns from heaven. So once again, the writer is using, remember once before we spoke about this, a Calvacoma argument. It's an argument which goes from the lesser to greater. And now, if the Son is greater than Moses, then those who would reject him now, those who are rejecting the present voice, are guilty of greater sin than are the Israelite fathers of the Exodus who rejected the voice of Moses on earth. Again, not dealing with loss of salvation, he's dealing with temporal, physical punishment in this life. He's dealing with physical death. Those living under the law did not escape temporal punishment for disobedience to the law. Therefore, how can one turn away from the new covenant and hope to escape temporal punishment? Not going to happen. Earlier on, the author showed that when the law was given on Mount Sinai, there was a great shaking. The mountain shook. He reminds the readers of this in verse 26. But now he also points out that the shaking on Mount Sinai was symbolic of the future final shaking of the heavens and the earth. There was a shaking in history because it says, whose voice then shook the earth, right? And we see that back in Exodus 19:18, Judges 5:4-5, Psalm 68, 8-9, Psalm 77:18, Psalm 114, verse 7. So what he's saying is there was this shaking in history, but you know what? There's going to be also a shaking in the future. And he brings a quote from Haggai, one of the minor prophets, Haggai chapter 2, verse 6, which deals with that final shaking by referring to the shaking that will occur before the second coming. Verse 26, yet once more will I make to tremble not the earth only, but also the heaven. So this final shaking consists of the judgments of the great tribulation that precede the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. Now, in Jewish apocalyptic literature, This verse was interpreted as speaking of the final eschatological earthquake involving the entire cosmos. That's how they see it in their apocalyptic literature. Now, in the past, God shook only the earth. But in the future, God plans to shake both the heavens and the earth. And this will occur in conjunction with the second coming. From Haggai 2:6, he draws a present application because there is a shaking, which is soon to come. This shaking will destroy Jerusalem and the temple. It's the shaking of AD 70. For the present time, the writer says that the one who spoke in Sinai and who shook Sinai is now speaking from heaven in grace. They're living in a time, these believers are living in a time between two shakings. God is now speaking quietly in grace, but he will speak loudly in judgment and with shaking in the future. When he speaks loudly with shaking, it will be in judgment and will bring the present order to an end. The order of the temple and the Levitical system will cease to operate. Eventually, there will be a final shaking in conjunction with the second coming. In verse 27, that final shaking before the second coming will introduce a final, unshakable order. And again, he requotes Haggai 2:6, where he says, yet once more. He's drawing the application here. The application is that which is shakeable is temporary. That which is unshakable is eternal. The fact that this earth was shaken once and will be shaken again shows us that this earth is temporary. That's why the shaking in verse 27 signifies the removing of those things that are shaken as of things that have been made. So the shakeable is to be destroyed, which is the earth, the heavens that we see, in order that those things which are not shaken may remain. Why are they going to remain? Because those things which are unshakable are eternal. The present system is shakeable and therefore it will be destroyed. But when the kingdom is set up, it will be unshakable. And in the Greek text, the author uses the word now. By using the Greek word nun, N-U-N, rather than the word tot, T-O-T-E, he indicates the shaking has already begun. Remember, this epistle was written somewhere between 64 and 66 AD, and the first Jewish revolt against Rome would break out in full force in AD 66. So in the 2 years preceding AD 66, there were several mini revolts in various cities located in the land of Israel. Got an itchy nose. Now, these mini revolts were a prelude to the Big Revolt. And in this verse, the writer implies the shaking has already begun, but the current shaking that they're going through is merely the prelude to the shaking that will bring an end to the present system. So he anticipated a very imminent destruction of Jerusalem. The temple and the old covenant are shakeable and therefore they're temporary. But the new Jerusalem and the new covenant are unshakable and so they are eternal. And according to Haggai 2:6, in that final shaking, the old will pass away and the new will be brought in. And this action will give the saints a fit place to live for all eternity. And the application to his audience here is that to go back to the Levitical system is to go back to something that is about to be shaken and destroyed. In verse 28, the author draws his conclusion. Wherefore, now since the readers are destined to receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken, the heavenly Jerusalem and the eternal kingdom of God, the application here is, let us have grace. As Revelation chapters 20 to 22 show, the millennial messianic kingdom will give way and will usher in the eternal order. Again, what he's doing here, he's re-emphasizing a point he made more than once, and that is the need to appropriate grace, harking back to Hebrews 4:16. These believers are in the midst of these trials, and this is not the time to think about returning to Judaism. This is the time to think about appropriating grace. They need to go to the throne of grace and ask for grace to help in their time of need. And the purpose of appropriating this grace is so that we may offer service. The believers are to serve God in a well-pleasing way. Serving God in a well-pleasing way means serving God in an acceptable way, in godly fear, with reverence and with awe, lest we should offend God. The blood sacrifices are no longer an acceptable way of appropriating grace. Now, why do they need to do this? They need to appropriate grace because in verse 29, the writer says that the alternative is divine judgment. And he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 24, where it says, where Moses writes, "For our God is a consuming fire." And these words were spoken to Moses when he exhorted the Israelites to not to serve idols, to turn away from idols. And this phrase points out that while God is a God of grace, he's also a God of judgment for those who fail to appropriate the grace available to them. If they fail to appropriate grace and instead return to Judaism, they will be judged with physical death. And so this is a warning of discipline in this life for those who would return to Judaism. And that is your lot for today. Thanks for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.